When something goes wrong at work or at home or in a relationship, what do you say to yourself? How do you talk to yourself? For a lot of us, that inner voice is harsh. It's not kind. It's critical, it's demanding, and there's often a particular edge to it when you are a Black person in this country, because so many of us have grown up learning in explicit and subtle ways that we don't have room to be anything less than exceptional, that we have to work twice as hard, that rest is a little bit of a risk, and that needing anything, needing any help, needing any gentleness, needing softness, or needing to just not be okay is a form of weakness that we simply cannot afford. We carry that into our jobs, our relationships, our parenting, our health. And most of us were just never given permission to put that down. My name is Dr. Kira Jones. I'm a licensed psychologist in Washington, D.C. and Maryland with Deeper Than Color, a strengths-based and social justice-oriented psychology group. And today I want to offer a different framing to self-compassion, one that's grounded in both research and in a long tradition of Black thinkers, our Black scholars, poets, and activists who understood what it means to be well, or what it means to need to be well in a world that's not always interested in our well-being. People who ask, well, what does care actually look like for us? That's what we're going to explore together in this talk. So what is self-compassion? There's this researcher named Kristin Neff who spent 2 decades studying self-compassion. She's not the last word on self-compassion, and I'll tell you why in a moment, but her framework is a really useful place to start because it names something that a lot of us have never named before. So she breaks down self-compassion into 3 parts. The first part is going to be mindfulness, is the ability to bring your awareness to the present moment as your experiences arise in that moment without judgment. So this mindfulness is going to be the ability to hold your painful thoughts and feelings with a little bit of perspective, to notice what's happening without being consumed by it, and to not over-identify with every hard moment as a definition of who you are. The second component of self-compassion is common humanity. So common humanity means recognizing that suffering, which is any kind of failure, any kind of discomfort, any kind of imperfection, are just a part of being human. It's a part of the shared human experience. And it's not evidence that you are uniquely broken or uniquely weak, or that you somehow deserve what's happening to you. That is common humanity. And the third component of self-compassion is self-kindness. This means responding to yourself with warmth when you're struggling, rather than harsh criticism. We talked about that inner critic. It is a way that we are being kind to ourselves, counteracting that inner critic. We're not pretending that things are fine, and we're not performing strength that we don't have, but instead we're treating our own pain the way that we would treat the pain of someone else that we genuinely love and care for. Here's the thing that surprises most people about the research about self-compassion. We often resist self-compassion because we think it's going to make us soft. We think, if I stop being so hard on myself, then I'll stop trying. I'll stop improving. I'll let myself off the hook. I'll let myself get away with mediocrity. But the data says the opposite is actually true. So people who practice self-compassion are actually more willing to take responsibilities for their mistakes. They have more sustained motivation. They have more resilience after failure. The inner critic doesn't make us better. It makes us more afraid. And fear and drive, or fear and motivation, are not the same thing. So I want to be honest about something. The framework that was developed by Dr. Kristin Neff and developed largely in mainstream Western psychology, it doesn't fully account for what it means to carry racialized stress, right? It doesn't account for what it means to live in a country where your body is policed, where your grief is minimized, where you have to advocate for yourself, for your own humanity on a recurring basis. So the idea of common humanity starts to hit different when that humanity hasn't necessarily been universally granted in our society. And so While this is not a reason to dismiss the whole entire framework of self-compassion, it is a reason to go deeper. And this is exactly where I want to go. So let's talk about some of the Black scholars and our own traditions and the way that we have theorized or conceptualized some version of self-compassion. The idea that you are worthy of your own care, that tending to yourself is not weakness, but something closer to resistance, is far from new. It has very deep roots in Black intellectual, spiritual, and activist traditions. And these are not footnotes to Western psychology. In many ways, these views have been here before Western psychology. Let's start with Audre Lorde, poet, essayist, activist, and Black feminist. In 1988, while she was battling liver cancer, she published a collection called A Burst of Light. And in this, she wrote what has become kind of the most quoted line, or one of the most quoted lines in wellness discourse, that caring for herself was not self-indulgence, but rather it is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. And I want you to hear the full weight of that. Audre Lorde wasn't writing a lifestyle piece. She was a Black woman, a queer Black woman, living with cancer, writing from inside a life that the world had constantly tried to diminish. And she understood that in that context, choosing to nurture yourself, to refuse to sacrifice yourself completely at the altar of productivity or at the altar of other people's needs or the movement's demands, was genuinely radical. And for Lorde, this was never just about the individual. Self-care was inseparable from care for the community. So the point wasn't to retreat into yourself. It was to sustain your capacity to be present for the ones that you love, your people, your children, for the work. And so that is a very different framing than treat yourself, right? This kind of idea that we genuinely associate with self-care. It is more of a collectivist view of care, saying, well, if I can care for myself, then I can be fully present and fully caring for the other people that are around me. And then there's Bell Hooks, cultural critic, author of more than 30 books, and one of the most important thinkers of the last half century. In her essay, Loving Blackness as Political Resistance, Hooks made an argument that I think is foundational to this whole conversation about self-compassion. She argued that white supremacy at a psychological level depends on Black people internalizing the messages of inferiority and of unworthiness, and that the system is not only sustained by external oppression, but is also sustained by getting people to carry the oppression internally inside themselves. So to see themselves as less, to believe that somewhere deep down, they deserve whatever bad happens to them. And so Hooks argued that choosing to love your Blackness, to love yourself, to love your history and your body and your community is a direct disruption of white supremacy, not because it changes the structures immediately, but because it refuses to let the structure live inside of you. So she has a book called Salvation, Black People in Love, where she goes further on this. She argues that real self-love has to include the willingness to be vulnerable. It has to include acknowledging pain and limitations rather than performing the strength that we don't have. So she was writing directly against the cultural script that says Black people, and especially Black men, have to be invulnerable to survive. She called that script a kind of a slow violence. And then we have Linda James Myers. She was a Black psychologist who developed what she called optimal psychology. This is an entire therapeutic and philosophical framework rooted in African tradition. Myers argued that the dominant Western worldview orients people towards the external, where your worth comes from what you achieve and what you own and how others are perceiving you. That kind of worth is finite and it is conditional, and it's fragile because it can always be taken away. The African-centered worldview she draws on is oriented much differently toward the internal, toward what she describes as a connection to something infinite, something that cannot be stripped away by circumstance or other people's judgment. Your worth in this framework is not something you earn, but rather it's something that you are. It is divine and it is prior to anything that has ever happened to you. This is self-compassion in a profound sense. And it's like an inheritance available to every person out there, every person looking at this. And then we can also talk about ma'at. So many of you have encountered this before, probably. Ma'at is the ancient Egyptian concept that encompasses truth, harmony, and balance. In the African-centered psychology tradition, compassion is one of the 7 cardinal virtues of Ma'at. This is something that scholars like Wade Nobles and Na'im Akbar drew deeply on. It predates Western psychology by thousands of years, and this is ours. All of these writers and activists and scholars drew from African-centered psychology and an Afrocentric worldview to really flesh out this idea of self-compassion being for us and being resistance for us because of the way that it can combat the internalized oppressions that have been forced upon us in this country. We all know that chronic racial stress produces measurable and accelerated biological aging and stressing. So self-care is not metaphorical, and it's more than just taking care of yourself. It is how we kind of show ourselves that we are worthy. And it is both physiological, emotional, psychological. It is also a collective effort. So why does self-compassion matter? And more specifically, why am I talking about self-compassion now? Being Black in the United States has always carried a particular weight. And I don't mean to say that as a diminishment. It's a plain statement of fact. There's the labor of navigating institutions like our workplaces and our healthcare systems and our legal systems that were not designed for us fully in mind, and that require a kind of constant vigilance and self-management and advocacy that most people around you are just not performing, and they don't have to perform. There's also the weight of code switching, of reading every room, managing every reaction or impression, deciding which parts of yourself to make smaller or which parts that you need to make bigger in which contexts. And that is real work. It is exhausting in ways that compounds over years and over decades. It actually compounds intergenerationally. And there is what researchers call racial battle fatigue, the cumulative psychological and physiological toll of navigating racism on a recurring basis. The microaggressions, the moments of having to decide whether to respond or let it go, low-grade alertness that becomes kind of like the background condition of life. You're just always kind of alert or on edge for some of us. The body keeps score, and the score is real. Many of us have this pressure of being a symbol for other people, of carrying the hopes and fears of family and of community and history. It's a form of love, for sure, but it also can be a form of weight that has no clear outlet and no obvious permission to be set down. So self-compassion in this context is not about ignoring any of this. It's not toxic positivity, and it is not pretending that the structural problems are not real or that individual wellness can substitute for collective justice and change. But what it is a refusal to let the external pressure become your internal voice. It's a refusal to do the work of the oppressive system for it by treating yourself as if you are worth less than you are. You have been surviving, and that is not nothing. The question that self-compassion asks us or asks of us is, what would it look like to do more than just survive? What would it look like to be well, to just be well. And so I want to close by giving you something to carry about this talk about self-compassion. And this is not a prescription, but just a few threads worth following. Audre Lorde also wrote this, and this one is less cited than the self-care quote, but I think it matters just as much. What is most important to me must be spoken. It must be made verbal and shared, even at the risk of having it bruised or misunderstood. I think that's what self-compassion actually looks like when it's fully realized. Not just tending to yourself quietly, but believing that your inner life, including your grief, including your questions and your exhaustion, and including your joy, is worth taking seriously, and it's worth speaking about. And not only because you've earned the right to share that, but because you are here and because you are a person. And bell hooks also this quite plainly. The work of self-love is not a feeling that arrives and stays. It's a practice, something that you can return to, especially when it's hard, and especially when the inner critic is at its loudest, especially when the world is giving you reasons to believe otherwise. So if you take one thing from today, notice how you talk to yourself, not to judge yourself for it, but to just notice and ask yourself, would I speak to someone else that I love this way? Would I speak to a friend this way? Would I speak to a relative this way? That noticing is the beginning of self-compassion, and beginning is enough. Thank you so much for joining me in this conversation about self-compassion. And of course, want to guide you over to deeperthancolor.com. So Deeper Than Color is a psychology practice that is social justice oriented, and that is comprised of psychologists of color, mostly Black psychologists, who can also offer you this nuanced view of healing and care and psychotherapy in a way that might be just the right fit for you. Thank you. Hope to speak soon.